Hey everybody, Dr. Wendy Askew here. Welcome to season 2 of The Whole Truth. Thank you for tuning in. We're kind of playing around with the format this season, and so tonight I'm solo. Our next episode, I'm bringing in a guest because this is going to be kind of a two-parter that we're doing, but tonight we're opening up the season within a really exciting area of medicine. It's really a new area of medicine that's growing. We've learned a lot about it in the past 10, 15 years, and it's something that everybody's probably heard of, but in case you haven't, tonight we're talking about the microbiome. So, what is the microbiome? We've known about it for over 150 years. All the different organisms and bacteria, the viruses, the fungi, the other critters that live within us. And it is estimated that there are trillions of bacteria that live within our bodies. We've got different microbiomes in different parts of our bodies. Tonight I'm going to be focusing mainly on what's called the gut microbiome. So, living inside of our intestinal tract, beginning from the mouth and extending all the way through to the exit side, we have got trillions of bacteria. There's different things called archaea, there's fungus, there's other organisms, and the majority of them are really, really important for our good health. So, we are more bacterial cells than we are human cells. Even more importantly, because I know that gives a lot of people the creeps, especially right now in the era we're living in the time of a pandemic, everybody's washing themselves and wearing their masks and not wanting to exchange any germs. These microbes that live within us are really, really important for our health and our proper functioning, and as we're going to touch on tonight, in a lot of disease states. We're starting to see just how important a healthy, good, intact microbiome with the proper balance of good commensal bacteria and not too many of the bad ones is in maintaining our health. So we're going to be diving into this, and I do need notes because this is a lot to unpack. So here we go. Trillions bacteria that cross over dozens of different phyla, hundreds even. There are viruses. There are fewer of them. There are fungi, right? And the the microbiome that we think of when we think of yeast a lot of the time would be vaginas. Some people notice yeast and things in their mouths, but they live all over our skin and everywhere. There are less commonly known things called archaea, and what's super important about these organisms is that they have they're active. They're not just living in our body. They've got genes, and so genes are like recipes for something to happen, for production of proteins and antibodies and nutrients. And so we've got all these organisms living in us that are busy all the time doing things. And the ones in our gut are nourished by the things that we take in and ingest. We're going to talk a lot about how we can help to have a balanced microbiome and favor the good ones over the bad ones in the next episode. But it's very important to know that all of these things living in us are important and we don't need to be afraid of them. So the reason why they're so important, there's a number of reasons why they're so important. They help us to break down the nutrients that we ingest, the food that we eat. They're very important in functions such as mood health through the production of metabolites that go into the production of neurotransmitters. And that's a fancy word, but there are lots of neurotransmitters which are chemical signaling messengers that are responsible for us being happy, being active, being tired, sleeping properly. Neurotransmitters do tons of stuff. They're important for mental health and depression and anxiety. They're important for things like metabolism of our drugs and medication. We're going to talk about that in a little bit more detail in a minute, but you may not realize it. In fact, your doctor may not realize it. But some of the differences in how different people metabolize medicines is directly related to their bacterial populations. Some of them actively metabolize a lot of the medications that we take on a regular basis, and so we're going to talk about those. Now, their genetic material outnumbers our genetic material by orders of magnitude. We, as humans, have about 25,000 different genes, which to me didn't seem like a lot, but people seem to think that's a large number. These bacteria and fungi and archaea that live within us have a genome that is coding for trillions of functions and proteins, so super, super important. And if I didn't put it already, they are extraordinarily important in our immune system function. And more and more that we learn our immune system is everything. Our immune system is the source of inflammation. It protects us. It somehow knows when to balance the difference between protecting us, recognizing our own cells and not attacking them in most cases, versus recognizing invaders and pathogens and attacking those appropriately. So it's doing this incredibly complex job of balancing defense and aggression and removal of threats. They're super important in the production of nutrients. Things like vitamin K. We can't produce vitamin K, and we need vitamin K in order for our blood to be able to clot. So this is a little bit high level. We won't get too deep into that. But vitamin D, some of the B complex vitamins, we can't make those things without the bacteria that live within us. So I'm going to try to give us a healthy respect and appreciation that not all bugs are bad bugs. I've been mentioning a little bit. They are fed by what we ingest, by the foods that we take in. And in American and Western societies, our diet has evolved quite a lot over the past 50 years. Industrialization and agriculturalization of our food sources has changed very much. The types of food that we eat and the way that we eat, and it's not evolved into a very good system. I think most of us would admit that, if we're being honest. And there are a lot of relatively new diseases that are bothering us or affecting us over the past 50 years too. And so we've shifted. Before, the things that would hurt us and kill us were the bad bacteria. And so antibiotics and antimicrobials, that therapy saved millions and millions of lives. It's been revolutionary. We may have been and continue to be harming some of the good bacteria through overutilization of antibiotics, forgive me. But the foods that we eat. The typical Western diet, they estimate, is comprised of about 70% of processed foods. So toast, cereals, breads, noodles, packaged sauces, things that we would put on them, foods that we can pop out of the freezer and stick into a microwave or an oven, are processed to a significant degree that they really don't generally have too much nutrition in them. We don't eat as many whole fruits or vegetables as we should, and we really don't pay much attention to fiber. And fiber is critical for these organisms living within us. That is their primary source for the good ones anyway. They need fiber, and when we don't give them enough fiber, they'll start to eat other things inside of us that they shouldn't be, and they can't produce their beneficial metabolites that actually function to protect us. So the next episode, I'm really excited. We've got a special guest who's coming on, and I think she's going to give us some great ideas and suggestions on how to support our microbiome, hopefully decrease autoimmunity and inflammation in our bodies. But we're going to switch back over here and just take a quick look at some of these pictures. So this is a picture of the lower intestinal tract. The light pink is the small intestine, and then the larger, darker pink is our large intestine. The majority of the microbiome that's metabolically active within us and contributing to health or disease states is located in the lower intestine and our large intestine. And on the two different sides of this diagram, the red side indicates things that aren't really beneficial for our microbiome and those organisms, and how they can possibly have a negative impact on our health, right? So it talks about altered pH, and sometimes you'll hear people talk about, oh, I need to drink my alkaline water, and I need to be more, need to get my pH back. And I don't know as much about that, but I do know that it's better for our bodies to be in a more alkaline state, and there are some easy things you can do. But when we throw off the pH in our body by eating too many refined carbohydrates and processed foods and not enough vegetables, it has a negative impact on the bacterial function and the populations. Eating too much protein. We like our protein. This is Texas. We like some red meat. We like some bacon. We like some meat on a stick. It's delicious. It's probably not the best thing that we should be eating, and there are tons and tons and tons of studies that kind of confirm again and again and again that larger amounts of red meat consumption are associated with higher rates of cancer. And that's probably linked to we're eating more red meat at the exclusion of eating more vegetables, fruits, less fiber, and the fiber and the bacteria, what they do with the fiber is very important for producing protective, beneficial compounds that decrease inflammation and protect the lining of the gut. So eating too much sugar, right? We all love sugar. It is no mistake that we eat the way we eat. The food industry and the engineers within the food industry have been dialing in, perfecting, studying the foods that are produced and given to us in packaged forms, chips, sweet things, whatnot, things at restaurants, are designed to trigger the receptors in our brain that make us eat more and more and more. They stimulate reward centers and they cause us to eat beyond the point of satiety, and usually by the time we realize we're full, that's 3 boxes of chips or plates of chips later before the entree even hits the table. But that's not an accident. These foods are designed. They will adjust the amounts of salt, the amounts of fat, the amounts of sugar that they put into the things that we eat so that we want more and more and more, and we get a little dopamine hit when we eat them. Saturated fats, so animal fats, meat, dairy, cheeses, things like that, not great for our microbiome. And then medications. And one of the big offenders to our microbiome are antibiotics, which are important, which are necessary, which are good in a lot of instances. But there are studies that estimate that probably only 1/10 of the antibiotics that are prescribed are actually really indicated. And that doctors have a big role in that. I will admit that I'm as guilty as others. Patients come in, feel well, they have an idea that if I just get on an antibiotic, it's going to be better. Sometimes you're going into the weekend and they think it's something, but I don't have time to get a culture back and they just need something, so we give them something to try to help get. But overuse of antibiotics has killed a lot. It doesn't just kill the bad bacteria that are infecting my kidneys or bladder or wherever they are. They'll kill a lot of the good bacteria that are living in our intestines and trying to help maintain our balance and health. So overuse of antibiotics is a big contributor to a damaged microbiome. So some of the negative effects of these environmental changes that we have adopted: the decreased production of short-chain fatty acids. And short-chain fatty acids, specifically a molecule called butyrate, very important in decreasing inflammation. And we know that the things that happen in the gut don't stay in the gut. It ain't Vegas, baby. What happens in the gut is able to get out into the circulation in the system, and there are known confirmed connections in health and the gut for conditions affecting the lungs, asthma, allergies, the brain, Alzheimer's disease, dementia, heart, the liver, cholesterol production. All these things are impacted by the health or the not health of our microbiome. The increased production of a metabolite called TMAO, methanolamine, it's a hard one, I'll find it, directly linked, and we understand the mechanism of action of how too much of this metabolite from the what you would call bad bacteria, for lack of a better word, they're called pathobionts, means that they're not necessarily bad in and of themselves, but if there's too many of them, then they can start to cause harm and illness. But too much of this metabolite is one of the primary triggers in the formation of atherosclerotic plaques, or the blockages that build up in our coronary arteries and in our great vessels that can result in heart attacks, strokes, and occlusion of our blood vessels, and then to decrease the supply of blood and nutrients to our organs. Lipopolysaccharides are chemicals that are found on bacteria that when they get into the bloodstream and into the circulation, they trigger an immune response and inflammation. Higher risk of heart disease, more inflammation, like I said, dementia, cognitive decline, pre-diabetes. Whereas on the other side, eating more fiber. Probiotic intake has not been confirmed in research studies, and there are some studies showing that when we do take in probiotics, they don't necessarily engraft, right? We're eating or taking, swallowing probiotics, which have good bacterial populations in them, although that is a thing. Not all the probiotics that you can find. There are some that you really don't want to introduce into your system if you can avoid it. But probiotics may or may not be helpful. They just haven't been confirmed to be helpful in any trials that I'm aware of. If you're aware of them, please share. I would love to have that information. And if we do eat a healthier diet, other things that support good microbiome function are exercise. So mild to moderate cardiovascular exercise done on a regular basis. Of course, cannabinoids appear to have an important role in helping the microbiome. And so taking better care of ourselves, getting enough sleep, water intake, all these things, you'll have better improvements in your cholesterol readings, lower amounts of inflammation, and potentially decreased risk of infections and antioxidants. So very important in our overall health. I want to talk a little bit about some of the research studies that I came across when I was doing some preparation for this talk tonight. And also thank you to my daughter who helped out with my, my visual aids here. So thank you, Hannah. I appreciate your time. I know you were up late studying and everything. Thank you, dear. So they've studied the microbiome in populations all over the world, and there's a lot of super interesting data that they've recognized. But in certain disease states, they have identified changes, alterations in the populations and the concentrations of certain bacteria. And one of the most important alterations in patients who suffer from illnesses and diseases is a loss of diversity, right? Because when all I'm eating are like tacos in the morning and Chick-fil-A spicy chicken sandwich for lunch, that's my favorite, and nothing but processed foods and sugars, most of the sugar that we eat gets absorbed in the stomach and in the upper part of our gastrointestinal tract, and so there's really nothing but waste material that even makes it down into the lower intestine. But if you're selecting for the bacteria that thrive on sugar and we don't feed the good ones the fiber that they need, there's less production of the short-chain fatty acids, and those helpful bacteria, either they die off or they will start to eat what's called a mucus lining inside of the large intestine. And that mucus lining is very important because it provides a protective barrier between what's supposed to stay inside of the large colon, poop, waste matter, the bacteria that all live there, and from the cells that can absorb nutrients and then put nutrients and other things, good or bad, to our bloodstream. Things like antigens that could potentially trigger an immune response, which is what we suspect is one of the things that need when we develop autoimmune diseases. So we're going to talk about them. But these are just some of the disease states that are associated with changes in abnormal ratios and proportions of our good and bad bacteria in our microbiome. Autism spectrum disorder, one of the big challenges right now. We have essentially no good treatments for it. It's epidemic levels. We don't really know exactly what causes it, but there's a lot of fascinating, very early clinical research looking at changes in the microbiome with respect to autism spectrum disorder. And just because I'm a little bit off topic anyway, off of my outline, some of the research on autism spectrum disorder, let me find my notes so I get this all correctly, right? So researchers study mice before they transfer those studies and start looking in humans. And they conduct studies on special mice that are bred to have no bacteria in their system. So these are little bubble mice. They live in these enclosed cages. Everything that they eat is controlled. They're not exposed to germs. They're called germ-free mice. And what they recognized was that those mice have slightly abnormal behavior patterns. They don't tend to socialize. They tend to groom themselves excessively, and they tend to perform repetitive behaviors, which bear some similarities with some of the behavior tics or habits that children with autism spectrum disorders can demonstrate. So they were researching in mice, and what they did was they took regular neurotypical mice that didn't have those traits, and they infused them with something called microbiome transplants, fecal microbiome transplants, right? So they took stool from patients who do have autism, and they transferred that into healthy, otherwise normal behaving mice, and those mice adopted the abnormal behavior traits. And they reproduced these studies in dozens of other studies looking at mice. So they would take these germ-free mice and they would give them fecal microbiome transplants of healthy mice with normal behavior traits, and their behaviors improved. They didn't 100% normalize, but they got much better. I think some studies showed an 80% reduction in some of the abnormal trials. They're actually, right now, ongoing over 200 clinical trials. If you go to clinicaltrials.gov, looking at fecal microbiome transplants in the treatment of many of these conditions in autism spectrum disorder. They've even looked at studies in adults with autism spectrum disorder and found that if they received a fecal microbiome transplant, that they showed significant improvement in some of their behavioral characteristics. And they continue to treat them with encapsulations of a microbiome, healthy microbiome. I believe it was an 18-week-long study, and they maintained those improvements in their behavior. So these are associations, and when you're a scientist, you're going to say you can't prove causality, you can just say there's an association. That's correct. But it's very exciting, very promising, and scientists are working to understand exactly the mechanism of how. But when you can take somebody who's suffered with autism spectrum disorder, the parents of the family of a child who has very, very limited behavior and interactions, and give them a significant improvement in their child's behaviors and ability to interact with each other, that is profound. So I think this is a really exciting, if not slightly gross, area of study, but it's amazing. So that was autism spectrum disorder. I was going to talk first about obesity, another huge epidemic that we are facing. I just heard on the radio, I don't know what I was listening to, we're estimating that 50% of the American population is on track to be considered obese by 2050. Now, I get it, we're not body shaming people, we're accepting people, all of those things, but we're talking about people's health. And when obesity is associated with high blood pressure, abnormal cholesterol, increased risks for cancers, dementias, other things, it's not about body shaming people. It's about living your best life and maintaining some degree of health and decreasing your chance of developing a lot of these really, really difficult to treat, potentially dangerous disorders. But I will be the first to tell you, I hear all day long from patients, I don't eat any differently than I did a year ago. I exercise 5 days a week. I don't eat more than 1,100 calories a day, and I cannot lose, and I'm gaining weight. And most doctors would just go, you know, you're obviously not being honest, or you're not counting properly. There are studies, again, in these fancy little germ-free mice. They're not particularly healthy, but where we know the ratios are off in patients who suffer from obesity, certain populations, and the two populations that I'm familiar with are Firmicutes and Bacteroides. And in a person with a lean phenotype, or they're a lean person, the ratio is typically on average of 3 to 1 for the concentrations of Firmicutes to Bacteroides. And when patients develop obesity and can't lose weight, those ratios are completely deranged, and it tends to favor a ratio closer to 30 to 1. So how it got that way in the first place is speculative. Was it through antibiotic use? Was it through an illness? We don't exactly know, but I'm here to tell you it may not all be in your head. And I believe people. If they tell me that they're doing what they say they do, I take them at their word. But it's very difficult to lose weight, and if there are factors residing in your large intestine that are beyond your control, you know, I think it's important to know, not because fecal microbiome transplant is necessary, available, and ready for prime time for everybody, but there are ways that we can support the healthier, good ratios of bacteria in our body. So they've conducted those similar studies with mice. They take lean mice, they would transplant into those mice the fecal microbiome of an obese individual, people, and the mice would gain weight even though they were being fed the exact same amount of food and getting the same amount of activity as their little cage mate who didn't get fat. So we know that the bacterial population and proportions have a big impact in metabolism and nutritional support, and how you're absorbing your nutrients and how we're laying them down in our fat tissue in some cases. Oh, I did want to mention also artificial sweeteners, and we were talking about the diet soda controversy. That may be involved in this as well, because sweeteners called non-nutritive sweeteners like aspartame and I forget what the other ones, but while the studies all say drinking diet sodas causes people to be obese, it doesn't make sense. We didn't really exactly understand, but we don't absorb those non-nutritive sweeteners, but our bacteria can metabolize them, and they can metabolize them into products that do get into the bloodstream and then get taken into the cells as stored as fat, so extra calories get put down that way. So that mechanism is really exciting or interesting for me to hear. And actually, I haven't had a diet soda in 2 weeks because of it, so for what that's worth. Autoimmunity. So I'm an autoimmune disease patient, and that's another family of illnesses that's hugely increasing in our society. very complex. You need to have the genetic predisposition to develop it, but then probably environmental insults, whether they're infections, whether it's an exposure to something, whether it's our immune system recognizes something that it shouldn't, as what they call it molecular mimicry, and it starts to think my skin is a foreign intruder, and so that's why I started to develop psoriasis everywhere. There's lots of different pieces that need to all fall into place for people to develop autoimmune conditions, but our microbiome is critically important in instructing our immune cells how to function. And it doesn't just, they say 70 to 80% of our system resides in the gut, but chemicals that are produced by our immune cells and the ones that transfer, get out into the bloodstream and into the lungs and into the rest of our body to do their job of fighting infections and treating injuries when we have some kind of an injury or an infection that needs to be treated. Okay, we got to wrap it up. The immune system is critically important, and the microbiome directs it on how to function. It helps to educate what types of cells need to be produced, what they should attack, what they shouldn't attack, and those things are established from birth, from the time of birth. So things like breastfeeding, hopefully lower cesarean section rates, less exposure to antibiotics in children. I am so sorry, I didn't realize I would run out of time so quickly, because there's tons more to be talked about, but the microbiome is a fantastic, exciting area of research that's growing. We're learning a lot about how all of the little commensal organisms that live within us are trying to help us. We just need to support them back a little bit more. So thank you all for checking in. I'll see you in a couple weeks.